What if everything you thought you knew about a beloved Hollywood family was a lie? What if the smiling red carpet photos, the warm father-son interviews, the picture-perfect marriage, all concealed a silent war, a family teetering on the edge of something darker than anyone could imagine? And what if, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles, two of Hollywood's most respected figures were found dead in their own home, and all eyes turned to their only son? Rob Reiner and Michele Singer Reiner were more than just household names. They were the power couple that never craved the spotlight, yet somehow illuminated every room they entered. He was the legendary director who gave us The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men. She was the steady force behind him, elegant, private, and fiercely devoted to her family. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But on December 14th, everything changed. At 3:30 p.m., the Los Angeles Fire Department received a medical emergency call from a private residence tucked in one of LA's quietest neighborhoods. When paramedics arrived, they found Rob and Michele dead. No movement, no life, no struggle, just silence. And within minutes, the internet exploded. Not because of the tragedy itself, though that alone was unthinkable, but because of who was at the center of the swirling accusations. Nick Reiner, their son, the boy who grew up in the lap of Hollywood royalty, the man who once co-wrote a film with his father based on his own struggles with addiction, the troubled heir who had spent more time in rehab than most people spend in college. Suddenly, Nick was no longer the quiet shadow in the background. He was the face on every screen. The whispers turned into roars. He did it. He finally snapped. Rob and Michele feared him. Nick killed them. And yet, there was no official confirmation. No mugshot. No perp walk. No formal charges. Only silence from the LAPD. And then, a single sentence from Nick that sent the internet into overdrive. "I am not the killer." What does that even mean? Is it a denial? A deflection? A desperate plea? Or is it the one truthful thing in a house now drenched in suspicion? You see, in a world addicted to answers, this case offers only contradictions. Sources close to the family claim Nick had been spiraling for months. Others say Rob and Michele were preparing to stage an intervention. Some claim there were heated arguments. Others say there was a recent reconciliation. But if Nick didn't do it, who did? Or worse, was this not a murder at all? Could it have been something else entirely? A suicide pact? A tragic accident? Or something no one has even considered yet? Over the next hour, we're going to dive deep, deeper than the headlines, deeper than the gossip blogs, deeper than the sound bites. We're going to reconstruct what happened in that house and what led to it. From the eerie quiet of that Los Angeles afternoon, to the final moments of Rob and Michele's lives, to the 72 hours Nick disappeared after their deaths, to the video statement that shocked the world. We'll take you through the forensic evidence the public hasn't seen, the family feuds that were buried in smiles, the financial clues that raise eyebrows, the voicemail that might just hold the key, and the one friend who claims to know the real truth, but hasn't told it yet. Because this isn't just about Hollywood. It's about legacy. It's about what happens when fame can no longer hide dysfunction. It's about grief, and guilt, and secrets. It's about a son accused of killing the very people who gave him everything, and a public that has already convicted him without trial. But is Nick Reiner truly guilty? Or is he the only one left alive to take the fall? And if he didn't do it, who did? Or more terrifyingly, what if no one did? What if the answer isn't black and white? What if this story doesn't end with justice, but with more questions? Because here's the most haunting part of all. In the days before their deaths, Rob Reiner was working on a new film, a political thriller, one that reportedly made enemies in very high places. And now he's dead. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe not. Either way, someone needs to tell this story. Not the sanitized, TMZ version. Not the hollow sympathy statements from celebrities who barely knew them. Not the Reddit theories. But the truth. Or at least, as close as we can get to it. Because somewhere inside this tragedy, between the headlines, the silence, and the surveillance footage, is a real story. And we're going to find it. So buckle in. Because this isn't just a mystery. It's not just a Hollywood tragedy. It's a story about family, fear, and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love, even from themselves. And it all starts with a scream. One neighbor, one report. They said they heard screaming coming from the house the night before the bodies were discovered. Screaming. But the official timeline says the Reiners were already dead by then. So who was screaming? And why? Stick with us. Because what comes next might just unravel everything you thought you knew. That question haunted the neighbors for days. Because, according to the timeline released by authorities, Rob Reiner and his wife Michele were already dead when that scream pierced the Los Angeles night. And yet, someone heard it. Multiple people. A woman's voice, agonized. Terrified. Short. Then suddenly, silence. It didn't make sense. But if there's one thing that defines this entire tragedy, it's exactly that. None of it makes sense. How could this happen to them? To Rob Reiner, an icon. A man who seemed to embody warmth, wit, and wisdom, both on screen and off. To Michele Singer Reiner, his lifelong partner, his moral compass. The woman who held the family together when the cameras weren't rolling. To the world, the Reiners were the kind of couple people aspired to be. Loyal, grounded, private, real. They were Hollywood without the spectacle, fame without the frenzy. So how did that story end in tragedy? To understand that, we have to go back. Way back. Before the headlines. Before the 911 call. Before the accusations. Back to the beginning. Because this isn't just a crime story. This is a story about legacy and the weight it carries. Rob Reiner was born into Hollywood royalty. His father, Carl Reiner, was a comedy legend. Part of the original brains behind shows like Your Show of Shows and The Dick Van Dyke Show. Rob was practically raised on sound stages and sitcoms. But he wasn't just a beneficiary of a famous last name. He earned his place. Starting as an actor on All in the Family, Rob's portrayal of Meathead turned him into a household name. But he didn't stop there. He transitioned into directing, and that's where the legend truly began. Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, hits, classics, generational markers, films that didn't just entertain, but stayed with you. Films about love, justice, growth, heartbreak, and truth. Truth. Isn't that ironic? Because now, after decades of revealing emotional truth through cinema, his own truth, the one buried inside his home, ended in silence. But behind every legendary man is someone few people talk about. And that was Michele. Michele Singer was never interested in the limelight. She was a lawyer, a thinker, a strategist. They met in the late 80s. Michele was working in the legal field, far from the Hollywood chaos. Rob, freshly divorced from Penny Marshall, was rebuilding his life. He once said in an interview, "Michele grounded me. She reminded me who I am when everything else felt loud." They married in 1989. Quietly. No paparazzi. No spectacle. And then they built a life that was rare in Hollywood. 35 years of marriage. No scandals. No affairs. No separations. Just them. Through his meteoric rise, Michele stayed in the background, but she was always there. Always the one he thanked. Always the one holding things together. They had 3 children. 1 biological, 2 adopted. But there was one child who always stood apart. Nick, Rob's son from his previous marriage to Penny Marshall. And it's Nick who would eventually become the storm at the center of their quiet empire. But we're not there yet. We're still in the time before the darkness. Before the whispers. Let's stay there for a moment, because it matters. You see, the Reiners were more than their careers. They were activists. They funded documentaries, spoke out against injustice, marched for causes most celebrities only tweeted about. They donated to mental health organizations, supported drug recovery programs, and were vocal about ending the stigma around addiction. Because they weren't just talking about it in the abstract. They were living it. Nick Reiner's battles with substance abuse weren't just public, they were personal. He overdosed multiple times. He was in and out of rehab by his mid-20s. He wrote openly about it. He even co-wrote the semi-autobiographical film Being Charlie with his father, a brutal depiction of what addiction does to a family. At press junkets, Rob called it the hardest project of my life. Not because of the script, but because it forced him to look directly at the pain he couldn't fix. Pain that came from watching his son disappear, again and again, into a world of needles, pills, and hopelessness. But they never gave up on him. Not Rob. Not Michele. They fought. They cried. They paid. They hoped. And Nick got better. At least, that's what they said. At least, that's what we were told. So why are we talking about this now? Because when tragedy strikes, people start rewriting the past. And in the wake of Rob and Michelle's deaths, people began whispering things they never would have dared say before. That Nick had relapsed. That tensions in the house had returned. That money was missing. That Rob had confided in a friend. I'm scared for what might happen if Nick snaps again. None of this is proven. But here's the thing about grief. It doesn't wait for facts. And in the vacuum of truth, speculation grows like wildfire. Especially when the victims were icons. Especially when the only potential suspect is family. Especially when the timeline doesn't line up. Because that scream? It happened at 2:15 a.m. the night before the bodies were found. A neighbor heard it. They filed a noise complaint. But nothing came of it. The police never followed up. And yet, official reports state Rob and Michelle were already dead by then. So who was screaming? Was it Michelle? Was she still alive when the world assumed she was gone? Or was someone else in the house? Nick? Someone we haven't considered yet? Or, and this is where it gets darker, was that scream not a moment of panic, but a moment of guilt? A release of something unspeakable? Let's pause. Because it's easy to villainize someone in the aftermath. It's easy to say he did it. It's harder to ask, why would he? Or even more difficult, could he really have done it? Nick Reiner is many things. Troubled, damaged, recovering. But is he capable of murdering his father and stepmother? Of drugging them, suffocating them, staging a quiet crime scene? Or has he simply become the perfect scapegoat in a case filled with shadows? Because here's the contradiction at the heart of this entire mystery. The Reiners were, by all accounts, happy. They had dinner plans the next week. Michelle had a Zoom scheduled for her charity work the next morning. Rob had just wrapped pre-production on a new film. Nothing suggested suicide. Nothing suggested despair. Except maybe something did. Maybe there were signs we missed. Because a week before they died, Rob told a friend during lunch, "If something happens to me, make sure the story gets told right." What does that even mean? Was it a joke? Or was it a warning? And if it was a warning, who was he afraid of? Because one thing's becoming clearer with every passing day. This wasn't a random tragedy. This was something planned. Something deliberate. Something buried deep within the very family Hollywood once idolized. And just when you think it can't get more bizarre, it does. Because 3 days before the deaths, a new will was signed. A will that changed everything. But we'll get to that. First, we need to understand who Nick really was in those final days before the 911 call. Because the last person to see Rob and Michelle alive was him. And his story? It keeps changing. Let's start with a question that's more complicated than it seems. Who is Nick Reiner? Not who he was. Not who he pretended to be in front of cameras. Not the cleaned-up version presented in press junkets. But the real Nick. The boy who grew up in a mansion surrounded by Hollywood elites. The teenager who spiraled into addiction before he even turned 18. The adult who was both a recovering addict and the son of an industry giant. Was he a ticking time bomb? Or just a broken kid trying to outrun a name too heavy to carry? Because let's be honest. When your last name is Reiner, you don't get to be anonymous. You don't get to fail quietly. You don't get to suffer in private. From the moment Nick was born, he was in the spotlight. Not directly, but through proximity. His mother was Penny Marshall. Yes, that Penny Marshall, the iconic actress from Laverne and Shirley, and a trailblazing female director in her own right. And his father? Rob Reiner, Hollywood royalty. Which means Nick was born into a world of expectations. But not necessarily into a world of emotional safety. You see, sometimes the children of the famous are given everything. Except the one thing they truly need, presence. Nick was shuffled between homes. Between nannies, between filming schedules and red carpets, between parents who were divorced before he was old enough to understand what marriage even meant. So is it any wonder that he began acting out? That the son of two towering Hollywood figures started to unravel behind the scenes? Here's what we know. By age 13, Nick was using marijuana regularly. By 15, he had moved on to harder substances, painkillers, cocaine, Xanax. By 16, he had already been in 2 rehab programs. By 18, he'd nearly died from an overdose. And by 20, he'd written a screenplay with his father about his experience. It was called Being Charlie. Let's talk about that for a moment. Because Being Charlie wasn't just a film. It was a public exorcism. A confessional. Nick poured his life into it. and Rob helped him shape it. On the surface, it was a beautiful moment, father and son healing through art. But behind the scenes, things were still unraveling. Nick wasn't clean. Not really. He admitted in later interviews that he relapsed during the filming of the movie based on his own recovery. And Rob? He was heartbroken. He wanted to believe that art could save his son, that telling the truth, finally, might cure the illness that had haunted them both. But addiction doesn't care about catharsis. It doesn't care about screenplays or red carpets. It just waits, quietly, patiently, until the next opportunity to take over. Nick Reiner was never arrested for violent crimes. No police records suggested aggression. But he was erratic. He was unstable. Friends from rehab described him as a tornado of emotions. One former roommate said, "He was brilliant one minute and terrifying the next. There was a darkness in him. Something you couldn't quite explain." Others defended him. "He was a victim of pressure," said another friend. "He was always chasing his parents' approval, and it never felt like enough." So which version of Nick do you believe? The broken boy with too many demons? Or the manipulative addict who knew how to play sympathy like a piano? Because both can exist in the same person. And here's the contradiction. Rob and Michele knew all of this. They knew Nick's pain. They knew his past. They knew his triggers. And they still welcomed him back into their home again and again. Even when others warned them not to. Even when there were signs it might not be safe anymore. Let's pause right there. Why? Why would two intelligent, successful, emotionally aware adults continue to put themselves in harm's way? Why would they ignore the signs? Why would they ignore him? Was it guilt? Was it love? Was it denial? Or was it something else, something more sinister? Because here's what few people talk about. The Reiners didn't just bring Nick back into their lives. They gave him power, financial power, emotional leverage, and recently, according to several sources, they gave him access to their estate planning. Let that sink in. After years of struggle, after multiple relapses, after countless disappointments, they trusted him again. It wasn't Nick. And that changes everything. Let's rewind. December 14th, a quiet Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles. No paparazzi, no public events, just a sun-drenched cul-de-sac lined with trees and million-dollar homes. A neighborhood so still, you could hear the wind carry through the palm fronds. Then, at exactly 3:29 p.m., a call came into the 911 dispatch center. The voice? Shaky, rushed, female, not Nick, and not Michele. It was the housekeeper. She had just arrived for her usual Sunday shift. Later than usual, delayed by traffic on the 405. But what she found behind the Reiners' front door froze her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just whispered the words that would send shockwaves through Hollywood. "They're not breathing." Let's dissect this moment by moment. According to the dispatcher's log, the housekeeper, Maria Alvarez, 57, reported finding both Rob and Michele in the living room. They were positioned side by side on the couch. Still, eyes closed. No signs of struggle. No blood. No broken furniture. Just stillness. A half-full glass of water sat on the coffee table. A book rested on Michelle's lap. A remote control between them. At first glance, it almost looked like they'd simply fallen asleep together. But Maria knew something was wrong. Immediately. Why? Because she'd worked for the Reiners for over 12 years. She'd seen every version of them. Exhausted, relaxed, even deeply hungover after dinner parties. But this wasn't that. They weren't breathing. Their skin was pale. Too pale. Their bodies cold. And their phones, both of them, were gone. That was the first red flag. Because Rob never went anywhere without his phone. According to close friends, he even slept with it next to him on the nightstand. Michele? She was the same. Constantly texting her sister. Checking updates for her advocacy work. But that day, both phones were missing. So where were they? And why did that matter? Because it suggested one thing. Whoever was in that house before Maria arrived didn't want anyone calling for help. Here's where things get murky. By the time LAFD paramedics arrived at 3:36 p.m., they confirmed both victims were unresponsive, without pulse, and exhibiting early signs of rigor mortis. In simple terms, they had been dead for hours, maybe longer, which raises a massive question. If Rob and Michele died in the morning, or worse, overnight, then why was no one notified until late afternoon? Why wasn't 911 called sooner? And more importantly, where was Nick? Because according to Maria, Nick's car was parked in the driveway when she arrived. She didn't see him in the house. But that car, that red Tesla Model S, was definitely there. LAPD would later confirm that the car had been moved later that evening. But by whom? Let's break this down further. Dispatch records show LAFD treated the scene as a Code 2 unresponsive, meaning immediate but non-violent intervention. It was only after determining both individuals were deceased that the call escalated to LAPD as a Code 7 suspicious death. And that's when things spiraled. Within an hour, the entire block was shut down. Crime scene tape, forensics vans, helicopters. The media didn't get wind of it until later that night. And when they did, panic. Not just because Rob Reiner was dead, but because no one knew how. No gunshots, no visible wounds, no drugs in plain sight. It was too clean, too quiet, too clinical. And yet, somehow, it screamed murder. Here's where the timeline gets even stranger. According to traffic camera footage obtained later by investigators, Nick's car was recorded leaving the neighborhood at 8:12 a.m. that same morning. So wait, if he left that early, was he even there when they died? Possibly not. But wait, remember that scream? The one neighbors reported hearing around 2:15 a.m.? That would mean Rob and Michele were still alive well after midnight, which contradicts the coroner's estimate of time of death between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., which, in turn, overlaps with the time Nick's car was seen leaving. So which is it? Did Rob and Michele die in their sleep? Were they alive in the early morning hours? Did Nick leave before or after their deaths? Or is there a piece of this puzzle we haven't found yet? Because, and here's the twist, there was a third vehicle spotted on the street that morning. A black SUV with tinted windows. Parked across the street from the Reiners' home. No plates. It was captured on a neighbor's Ring camera. And guess what? It hasn't been identified to this day. LAPD claims they're following leads. But privately, sources say they've hit a wall. So the question remains, who was in that SUV? And did they see something? Or worse, do something? Let's go back to Maria, the housekeeper. In her formal statement, she mentioned something odd, something chilling. She said that when she walked into the house, it smelled different, like a cleaning chemical, but stronger, sharper, not something she'd ever used in their home. It was faint, fading, but there, almost like someone had wiped something down in a hurry. She didn't think much of it until she noticed the missing phones. And then, something else. The security camera system? Disabled. Offline. Every camera in the house had been disconnected from the cloud. The feed was dead. Why? Why disable the cameras? Why take the phones? Why leave the bodies so neatly posed? And then, perhaps the most overlooked clue of all. The front door was unlocked. Not forced. Not broken. Just left slightly ajar. Like someone had exited in a hurry or wanted to make it look like nothing was wrong. Let's pause here and ask a hard question. If you were trying to stage a scene to look peaceful, to make it seem like two elderly parents had simply passed away in their sleep, what would you do? You'd remove anything that suggested conflict. You'd pose the bodies calmly. You'd clean up. You'd take away phones. Anything that could hold evidence. And you'd make sure security footage didn't exist, right? So the next question is, who had the motive and the familiarity to pull that off? Who knew the camera systems? Who had access to the alarm codes? Who had been in the house enough times to move around unnoticed? It's a short list, a very short list. And at the top of it, Nick. But before we point fingers, there's one more twist. And it's a big one. Remember how we said the 911 call was placed by the housekeeper? Turns out, it wasn't the first call that day. Because buried in dispatch records was an earlier attempt. A call that started at 11:22 a.m., but disconnected before a dispatcher could answer. No callback number. No voice. Just a 12-second silence. The call came from a burner phone, traced to a prepaid SIM purchased at a Rite Aid 48 hours earlier. Location? Just 4 blocks from the Reiners' house. So the real question becomes, who made that call? And why didn't they stay on the line? Were they panicking? Regretting something? Trying to undo something? Or trying to confess? Because if someone tried to report what happened and then backed out, that could mean they weren't a killer. They were a witness. Or worse, an accomplice. And that opens an entirely new door we weren't ready to walk through. Because if Nick wasn't acting alone, then who else was in that house? And what were they hiding? If Nick Reiner wasn't alone in that house, then who else was? Let's shift the lens for a moment. We've focused so much on what happened inside the Reiner home, on the carefully staged scene, the chillingly still bodies, the suspicious 911 calls, that we've nearly ignored something crucial. What was going on outside the house? Because while the crime scene whispered quiet deception, the neighborhood, like all neighborhoods, had eyes. And one pair of those eyes saw something unforgettable. Meet Laura Denton, 61 years old, lives 3 doors down from the Reiners. Retired art teacher, known around the neighborhood for her rose garden and her distrust of tech. No security cameras, no Alexa, still uses a flip phone. But she watches, always has. And on the night of December 13th, just hours before Rob and Michele were found dead, Laura claims she saw something that made her blood run cold. Let's set the scene. It's 1:48 a.m. Laura's up, late watching reruns of Columbo. Insomnia, she says. She decides to get a glass of water, passes her front window, and pauses. Because something across the street catches her eye. Movement. A figure standing in the Reiner's driveway. Pacing. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like a trapped animal. She squints. Pulls the curtain aside. It's a man. Slender. Wearing what looked like a hoodie and pajama pants. Disheveled. Agitated. He keeps rubbing his head. Mutters something she can't hear. Kicks the front tire of the red Tesla. Laura doesn't panic. She figures it's Nick. She's seen him before. Not often, but enough to recognize the posture, the hair. She's about to look away when something changes. The man stops pacing, stares directly at the front door, and then he screams. A short, raw, guttural scream. One she says sounded more animal than human. Not long, not loud enough to wake the entire street, but guttural, from the gut, like a release of something unbearable. Then, silence. He looks around, walks to the Tesla, gets in, and just sits there. Engine off. Lights off. No movement. For at least 20 minutes. Eventually, Laura went back to bed. The next morning, she chalked it up to a bad night. Maybe a fight. Maybe drugs. She had no idea, of course, that by that time, Rob and Michele were already dead. But what she didn't tell reporters, not at first, is the part that changed everything. She didn't just see Nick. She saw someone else. 3 days after the story broke, Laura was approached by a local journalist from a true crime blog. She agreed to speak, off the record, and that's when she said it. There was a second figure. Smaller. Stayed in the shadows. She's not sure when the second person arrived, but at some point. Maybe 20 minutes after the scream, she noticed movement near the hedges beside the Reiner garage. Someone crouched, unmoving, watching. She couldn't make out features, just shape. Shorter, slighter. She assumed it was a woman. But here's the thing. Laura never saw that second person leave. They were just gone. Disappeared. She didn't think it was important. Until the next day. Until she saw the police. The body bags. The media trucks. And suddenly, her quiet neighborhood was a crime scene. So what does Laura's story mean? First, she independently confirms the scream that LAPD initially dismissed as a misinterpreted sound. Second, she places Nick at the scene at 1:48 a.m., contradicting the assumption that he left before the deaths occurred. Third, and most damning, she introduces a second unknown person into the narrative. Now, skeptics were quick to point out that Laura had no security footage, no photos, no proof. Just her word. But there's one detail she gave that no one else could have known. She described the exact placement of the Tesla in the driveway. Angled slightly right, rear tire over the edge of the flower bed. That detail was later confirmed by police records and ring camera footage from a neighbor across the street. She also recalled the hoodie the man was wearing had a faded red graphic on the back. Guess what Nick Reiner was photographed wearing 3 days earlier? A faded red rehab center hoodie from Arizona Recovery Pathways. Coincidence? Maybe. But Laura's statement was enough to earn her a visit from LAPD's Homicide Division. And now, her testimony is part of the official timeline. But there's another twist. That black SUV. Remember the mystery vehicle spotted by ring footage? It was parked in front of Laura's house the morning of the deaths. She didn't see it. Didn't even know it was there. But the timestamp places it on her street from 5:42 a.m. to 7:03 a.m., which is interesting, because the estimated window of death, according to the coroner, 6 to 8 a.m. So now we have 3 overlapping timelines. Nick, Outside the house at 1:48 a.m., an unidentified second person crouched near the garage. A black SUV parked near the crime scene during the likely time of death. And one disconnected 911 call, made at 11:22 a.m. from a burner phone bot just blocks away. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. That's coordination. That's something planned. Let's circle back to the scream. What was it? A cry of rage? Of grief? Of guilt? Did Nick discover the bodies and scream? Or did he cause what led to that scream? Or was that scream from the second person, the one Laura saw crouched by the hedges? Did they witness something? Or were they waiting for it to happen? Because the psychology of that moment matters. People don't scream for no reason, especially not in a neighborhood where silence is standard. And especially not someone trying to hide a crime. So what broke inside Nick Reiner that night? Was it a moment of realization? Of regret? Or was it something deeper? Something darker? Something rehearsed? It's also worth noting that Laura's statement was nearly suppressed. LAPD didn't release it. The journalist did. Only after it appeared in a Reddit thread and picked up traction on TikTok did law enforcement acknowledge that multiple witness accounts are under review. Why hide it? Why try to control the narrative? Unless, of course, it didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. Or unless Laura saw something they didn't want getting out. Like a second suspect. Or a botched timeline. Or a potential alibi Nick doesn't want known. Because if Nick wasn't alone that night, then who was with him? Who would show up at 2 a.m.? Who would crouch in the shadows? Who would leave before the bodies were found? And most importantly, who had something to gain? Because no murder happens in a vacuum. And in the Reiner's world, where fame, fortune, and family intertwine, motive is never simple. It's layered. It's masked. It's buried under years of love and resentment. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because what happened after the scream might be even more disturbing. Because Nick vanished. For 72 hours. No phone. No sightings. No explanation. Where did he go? And what was he hiding? Where do you go when your entire world dies? And everyone thinks you killed it? That was the question millions were asking as news spread that Nick Reiner, son of Rob Reiner and Michele Singer, was missing. Gone. Not detained. Not in custody. Not giving statements. Just disappeared. For 72 hours. 3 full days. No phone calls. No interviews. No sightings. Not a single security camera ping in all of Los Angeles. How does someone with a face known to millions, someone connected to one of Hollywood's most influential dynasties, vanish right after his parents are found dead? Let's walk through it. Let's map the mystery, hour by hour. Because what happened in those 3 days may hold the answer to everything. We begin at 3:30 p.m., December 14th. The moment Maria Alvarez, the housekeeper, discovers Rob and Michele's bodies and places the now infamous 911 call. LAPD arrives minutes later. So does LAFD. When a man says the same sentence 4 times in a row, who exactly is he trying to convince? By the time Nick Reiner's video dropped, the world had already formed its verdict. Social media had tried him. True crime podcasts had dissected him. News anchors danced around the word guilty without ever using it outright. He was the addict's son, the black sheep, the loose cannon. And now, after 3 days of eerie silence, he finally spoke. But instead of clarity, he delivered confusion. Instead of explanation, he repeated a single phrase, a sentence that echoed like a desperate prayer, or maybe a warning. I am not the killer. Over, and over, and over. No details, no timeline, no denial of involvement. Just those 5 words, said 4 times. Then static, and the screen went black. The video was exactly 17 seconds long. Unlisted. Uploaded to an anonymous YouTube channel with a username made of random letters and numbers. And yet, within an hour, it had over 2 million views. Because people recognized the voice immediately. It was Nick. But what they didn't recognize was the man speaking. Let's talk about the video itself. It wasn't shot in a studio. It wasn't polished. It wasn't planned. It looked like it was recorded in a dim hotel room. No visible details, just a dark background, maybe a curtain behind him, a flicker of light coming from a single lamp off-screen. Nick's face was half in shadow, eyes hollow, unshaven, clothes rumpled, voice shaky but firm. There was no script, no lawyer present, no framing, just raw, breathy honesty, or the illusion of it. And the moment he said it the first time, the world paused. I am not the killer. Then again, I am not the killer. By the third repetition, something shifted in his tone, like he was holding back something. And by the fourth, his voice cracked. Just slightly. I am not the killer. Was it guilt? Grief? Fear? Or manipulation? Because let's be honest, when someone repeats a denial that many times, you don't feel reassured. You feel suspicious. You feel unsettled. You feel like you're hearing a man trying to escape something he knows is closing in on him. And maybe, something he helped set in motion. Let's analyze what Nick didn't say. He didn't say where he'd been. He didn't say when he last saw his parents. He didn't say what he knew about their deaths. He didn't even say he wasn't there. He only said he wasn't the killer. But here's the thing about language, especially when used under pressure. Words matter, and so do omissions. Because I am not the killer is different from I didn't do it. It leaves space, wiggle room, ambiguity. It allows for complicity, even participation. It avoids specifics. It dances around truth. And the internet noticed. Instantly, breakdown videos flooded YouTube. Body language experts, trauma analysts, speech pathologists, all asking the same question. What is Nick hiding? And perhaps more disturbingly, who was that video for? Think about the context. This wasn't a press conference. This wasn't a lawyer-drafted statement. This wasn't a denial posted by a PR team. This was a handheld, grainy, borderline frantic upload to an anonymous YouTube channel. So who was Nick talking to? The public? The police? His own conscience? Or was it a message to someone else? Someone who knew the truth? Because theories exploded online. That the video was a coded message. That I am not the killer wasn't a denial, but a line from an argument. That he was quoting someone, or trying to prove he was being framed. Some even suggested Nick was under duress. That he was being forced to read a script. That someone, off-screen, was watching. Because the tension in his body was palpable. His shoulders were tight. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted, just slightly, after the third sentence. And in the final seconds, before the video cut off, his lips moved again, but the sound was cut. Was there more? Was there another line? Was it edited? Did he try to say something else, something that was removed? No one knows. Because moments after the video went viral, the channel was deleted. Completely. No trace. Gone. Then came the silence. For 24 hours, Nick said nothing. And neither did the LAPD. They refused to comment on the video. Refused to say if they'd spoken to him. Refused to confirm if they even knew where he was. It was like he didn't exist. But the world kept spinning. Reddit threads went nuclear. People analyzed the reflection in his pupils. Some claimed they could see a figure standing behind the curtain. Others enhanced the audio, said they heard whispering. One video swore it heard the word, help, buried beneath the static at the end. Was it real? Paranoia? Or intentional misdirection? Because that's when things got even darker. A former friend of Nick's, another rehab buddy, posted a cryptic message on X, formerly Twitter. Nick was never the type to get his hands dirty, but he knew people who would. That post got over 9 million views before it was taken down. The account? Deleted. The friend? Unreachable. And now? Now the theory shifted. Maybe Nick didn't kill Rob and Michele. Maybe he just set the table, left the door unlocked, disabled the cameras, lit the fuse, then walked away, letting someone else do what he couldn't. There's one more detail no one talks about. Right after the video posted, within the hour, someone logged into Michele Reiner's iCloud account. An IP pinged from a device in San Diego, 3 hours from Los Angeles, accessed her notes, and downloaded a file titled Final Thoughts. No one knows what was in it. The file was deleted minutes later, and when police tried to recover it, the cloud backup had been disabled. By who? From where? The same San Diego IP? Or someone using Michele's login? Could it have been Nick? Or someone else trying to erase what she might have left behind? And here's the creepiest part. That login used two-factor authentication. It required the second verification code, which was sent to Michele's phone, a phone that has never been recovered. So who has it? Where is it? And what was in that file? Because maybe, just maybe, Michele saw something coming. Maybe she wrote it down. Maybe she tried to leave us a clue, and someone made sure it disappeared. Just like the video. Just like the burner phone. Just like Nick, for 3 entire days. The video said one thing. I am not the killer. But it opened the floodgates to questions far more sinister. Because now the world wasn't asking if Nick did it. They were asking who helped him. Or worse, who ordered it. And just when the pressure on the police reached its boiling point, they made their move. Nick Reiner was arrested. But not for murder. Not yet. They took him in for questioning. And what they found at his apartment would blow the case wide open. What if the people closest to Rob Reiner had seen this coming and said nothing? The day Nick Reiner was arrested, the world expected handcuffs, charges, courtroom drama. What they got instead was something much quieter, but far more unnerving. He wasn't booked for murder. He wasn't charged with a crime. He was brought in for questioning. A move the LAPD claimed was standard protocol. But behind closed doors, the interrogation room was lit with suspicion. And as word spread that Nick was in custody, though not yet labeled a suspect, Hollywood began to stir. Not the industry. The people. The ones who knew Rob and Michele intimately. The friends who shared dinners, vacations, decades of laughter. And slowly, they began to speak. Not to the press. Not on red carpets. But behind the scenes. Whispers. Leaked voicemails. Private DMs. Anonymous posts. And the picture they painted wasn't the one we were expecting. Let's start with one of Rob Reiner's oldest friends. We'll call him James, a writer, producer, and dinner guest at the Reiner home for over 20 years. James spoke to an insider journalist under strict anonymity. What he said shook everything. Rob loved Nick. Fiercely. But he was afraid of him too. I saw it. According to James, Rob confided in him 3 weeks before the tragedy. They were having drinks at a mutual friend's home in Malibu. Nothing formal. Just a casual get-together. But Rob, normally so composed, seemed distracted. Nervous. He talked about Nick more than usual. Kept circling back to the same sentence. I don't know how much more I can do. James pressed. Asked what he meant. Rob reportedly looked him in the eye and said, I'm scared he's going to do something we can't take back. James thought it was a reference to a potential relapse. Or maybe self-harm. He never imagined it could mean this. But now, he's not so sure. Other friends started speaking too. One of Michele's oldest confidants, her college roommate, Susan, told an entertainment blog. Michele was walking on eggshells. She adored Nick. But she also didn't trust him anymore. She told me, he's not the same kid we raised. According to Susan, Michele confided in her just 5 days before the deaths. They were texting about holiday plans. Michele said they'd decided not to travel this year. She wrote, too much going on. Tensions at home. Nick's here. We're trying to keep things calm. That line, trying to keep things calm, echoed throughout Michele's recent conversations with friends. Multiple sources confirmed it. She was holding something back. Or maybe, protecting someone. Maybe both. Then came the voicemail. Leaked. Not to the press, but to a Reddit user. Unverified, but chilling. Allegedly from Michele to her sister, 2 nights before the incident. Her voice is low. Whispered. We may have made a mistake letting him back in. I think he's using again. Please don't say anything yet. I don't know what to do. If it's real, and multiple experts have authenticated the tone and cadence, it suggests one thing loud and clear. Michele was scared. And if she was scared, then the narrative of a peaceful home shatters. Because that means this wasn't an accident. This wasn't sudden. It was building. Slowly. Quietly. Like a fire under the floorboards. Hollywood insiders close to Rob say he had been preparing to stage an intervention again. He was waiting for the right moment. Waiting until after the holidays. But time ran out. And some think Nick sensed it. Because the week before Rob and Michele died, Nick's behavior, according to friends, shifted. He was tense. Agitated. He stopped responding to texts. Missed 2 therapy sessions. Snapped at a barista at his favorite coffee shop. Something completely out of character. He told a friend, I feel like they're about to cut me off again. That same friend, who asked not to be named, said Nick believed Rob and Michele were talking to a lawyer. He thought they were setting him up. That they were going to change the will. That they were going to take everything back. Everything. The trust fund. The inheritance. The house he occasionally stayed in. The access to their money. The power. So if that was the case, did Nick strike before they could? Or was he spiraling? Afraid of being abandoned again? Of being left with nothing? Let's talk about the will. Sources close to the family claim Rob had recently made changes. That a new version was drafted, but not yet signed. That version allegedly reduced Nick's portion. transferred majority control to a private foundation run by Michele. In other words, Nick was about to be written out. And he may have known. A lawyer who'd worked with the Reiners in the past refused to go on the record. But off the record, he said, there were concerns about Nick's stability, about his spending, about his access. So if the Reiners were planning to legally sever financial ties, that's motive. Plain and simple. But still, motive doesn't equal guilt. Unless there's opportunity. And Nick had both. More friends spoke out. One described a dinner party 2 months before. Nick showed up late. Stumbled in. Eyes bloodshot. His speech was slurred. Rob was embarrassed. Michele tried to play it off. But when Nick left early, the mood shifted. Rob told another guest, he's going to destroy us. Again, ambiguous. Hyperbolic? Maybe. But in hindsight, it sounds like prophecy. Then there's the friend who visited the Reiner home just 10 days before the deaths. He walked into the kitchen to find Michele and Nick mid-argument. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, tense. He heard Nick say, if you don't trust me, why let me in at all? And Michele responded with something that now feels like a haunting echo. Because we're your parents. That's what we do. It wasn't love. It was duty, obligation, desperation. And that's what so many friends have echoed since. That Rob and Michele were trying to save Nick again. That they believed in him again. Even when others had stopped. Even when the signs were screaming danger. They hoped. They believed. They paid. And it cost them everything. But what none of the friends knew, what no one knew, is what police found in Nick's apartment after his arrest. A single drawer. Locked. Inside. A notebook. Filled with journal entries. Rambling. Disjointed. Half poetry, half confession. One page. Torn. Water-stained. Read. They were going to erase me. I saw it. I felt it. I became the ghost before they made me one. Another said, I didn't do it. But I wanted to. Is that the same thing? And the most chilling? Scrawled in red ink. I am not the killer. I am the reason. Friends of Rob and Michele are grieving. But they're also talking. And every sentence adds another crack in the glass. Because maybe this wasn't just about addiction. Maybe it wasn't just about money. Maybe it was about something more primal. Fear. Control. Resentment. Legacy. Because when someone like Rob Reiner dies, someone beloved, powerful, untouchable, you want there to be a reason. A clean story. A villain. But what if there's no such thing? What if everyone in this story was broken? What if everyone played a part? And what if the real villain hasn't even been named yet? Because up until now, we've only looked at Nick. But what if the answers lie elsewhere? In the toxicology report. In the silence of the autopsy. In the strange cocktail of substances found in Rob and Michele's blood. Because what the coroner found changes everything. What if Rob and Michele didn't die at the hands of another, but by something far stranger? By the time the coroner's office released the preliminary findings, the public was foaming at the mouth for answers. We had the timeline, mostly. We had Nick's bizarre disappearance. We had rumors, statements, and a 17-second denial video that raised more questions than it answered. But we didn't have the how. How did Rob Reiner and Michele Singer Reiner actually die? Was it strangulation? A weapon? Blunt force trauma? None of the above. Because according to the Los Angeles County Coroner's initial report, both Rob and Michele died from cardiac arrest, brought on by what was described as a potent combination of substances consistent with sedative and respiratory depressant use. Translation? They were drugged. But the drugs found in their system weren't just sleeping pills. They were part of something much more intentional. And that's when the entire narrative cracked open. Because now, the idea of murder got complicated. Now we were dealing with dosage, delivery, access, and most chillingly, consent. Let's dive into the autopsy findings line by line. According to the report, Rob and Michele's time of death was estimated between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., December 14th. This already contradicted the scream neighbors claimed to have heard at 2:15 a.m. and Nick's car scene leaving around 8:12 a.m. But it gets more twisted. Toxicology revealed a combination of 3 substances. Diazepam, Valium, a common anti-anxiety sedative, often prescribed for insomnia or emotional distress. Zolpidem, Ambien, a sleep aid, known to cause drowsiness and confusion in high doses. Carfentanil, an ultra-potent synthetic opioid not used in human medicine, typically used to sedate elephants. Let that last one sink in. Carfentanil is 100 times more potent than fentanyl. It is not something you pick up at CVS. It is deadly in micrograms, and it was found in both Rob and Michelle's bloodstream. Not trace amounts, lethal amounts. Now ask yourself, how does a retired film director and a semi-retired lawyer end up with carfentanil in their system? It's not recreational. It's not prescribed. And it's certainly not something either of them were known to be using, which means someone introduced it. Someone with access. Someone who either knew exactly what they were doing or had no idea how deadly it really was. Which brings us back to Nick. Let's go back to that journal found in his apartment. Among the chaotic ramblings, there was one entry circled in black ink. It read, "I found the thing that lets people go peacefully. Just one drop, and you never have to suffer again." Investigators believe this may be a reference to carfentanil. But how would Nick have even obtained it? Enter the darknet. Search warrants executed on Nick's devices, including a recovered iPad from a storage unit he rented under a fake name, revealed Tor browser activity, crypto wallets, and access to encrypted forums known for selling illicit substances. One of those wallets showed a transaction, small but precise, less than 2 weeks before the Reiners' deaths. $1,400 worth of cryptocurrency sent to a flagged address suspected of trafficking lethal synthetics. Coincidence? Or preparation? But here's where it gets even murkier. Despite the drug cocktail, there were no injection marks found on either Rob or Michele. No signs of pills in their stomach. So how was the drug delivered? Investigators now believe the substances were mixed into a beverage. Wine. A vintage bottle opened the night before was found in the kitchen. Only one glass remained half full, sitting on the coffee table, centimeters from Rob's hand. Tests confirmed the presence of all 3 substances in that glass. So now the question becomes, did Rob and Michele pour the drinks themselves? Or did someone serve it to them? Was this a private nightcap that went horribly wrong? Or something far more sinister? Was it suicide? A mutual pact? Or were they given something under the guise of something else? Because this wasn't just a sleeping aid overdose. This was calculated. The levels were too specific. The ratios too clean. Whoever prepared this knew the effect it would have. They knew the combination wouldn't cause panic or seizures. They knew it would shut down the body gently, peacefully, like a script from a film. There's another clue. Both Rob and Michele were found on the couch, side by side. No signs of struggle. No signs of movement. Their facial expressions, according to the report, were relaxed, as if they drifted off. Together. Was that their plan? Or someone else's choreography? Let's revisit what Nick said in his notebook. They were going to erase me. I became the ghost before they made me one. I didn't do it. But I wanted to. Is that the same thing? Chilling words. Words that suggest desire, but not necessarily action. But someone took action. Because carfentanil doesn't just appear in a wine bottle. Someone put it there. Someone with motive, means, and opportunity. Here's where the case twists again. Investigators also found trace residue of carfentanil on Michele's laptop keyboard. That's right. Her keyboard. Not Nick's. Not Rob's. And on that laptop, an encrypted folder. Inside it, a single PDF, titled, "Right to Die, Legal Pathways in California." It was downloaded 4 days before her death, which raises a terrifying possibility. Did Michele plan this? Did Rob agree? Was this a joint decision? Or was she trying to prevent it? Trying to understand it? Was she researching ways to help someone else? Or stop them? No one knows. The document had been closed quickly. Only viewed once. No notes. No highlights. But the fact that she searched it at all tells us something. She was thinking about death. Actively. Recently. Deliberately. So was this a suicide pact? A mercy killing? Or the dark conclusion to a family falling apart? Then came the gloves. Late into the investigation, crime scene technicians discovered a pair of latex gloves in the kitchen trash bin, beneath layers of paper towels, eggshells, and receipts. On them, partial fingerprints. Nick's. And a small smudge of carfentanil. When confronted with this evidence during questioning, Nick didn't deny they were his gloves. But he said something strange. "I was cleaning. I didn't want to leave a mess. That's all." A mess? Or a trail? Because now, the LAPD was leaning toward a theory that no one wanted to say out loud. That Rob and Michele may have been poisoned. That the peaceful scene was staged. That the suicide theory was a smokescreen. and that the only person with the access, the motive, the knowledge, and the history was Nick. But proving that was another matter entirely, because Nick had an alibi, a partial one, and someone was protecting him, a name that hadn't surfaced before, a name that would upend everything, because Nick didn't buy the drugs alone. He didn't plan this alone, and he may not have been the one who served the wine, because the next witness was about to change everything. It wasn't Nick, and that changes everything. Let's rewind. December 14th, a quiet Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles. No paparazzi, no public events, just a sun-drenched cul-de-sac lined with trees and million-dollar homes. A neighborhood so still, you could hear the wind carry through the palm fronds. Then, at exactly 3:29 p.m., a call came into the 911 dispatch center. The voice? Shaky, rushed. Female. Not Nick. And not Michele. It was the housekeeper. She had just arrived for her usual Sunday shift. Later than usual, delayed by traffic on the 405. But what she found behind the Reiners' front door froze her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just whispered the words that would send shockwaves through Hollywood. They're not breathing. Let's dissect this moment by moment. According to the dispatcher's log, the housekeeper, Maria Alvarez, 57, reported finding both Rob and Michele in the living room. They were positioned side by side on the couch. Still, eyes closed. No signs of struggle. No blood. No broken furniture. Just stillness. A half-full glass of water sat on the coffee table. A book rested on Michele's lap. A remote control between them. At first glance, it almost looked like they'd simply fallen asleep together. But Maria knew something was wrong. Immediately. Why? Because she'd worked for the Reiners for over 12 years. She'd seen every version of them. Exhausted, relaxed, even deeply hungover after dinner parties. But this wasn't that. They weren't breathing. Their skin was pale. Too pale. Their bodies cold. And their phones, both of them, were gone. That was the first red flag. Because Rob never went anywhere without his phone. According to close friends, he even slept with it next to him on the nightstand. Michele? She was the same. Constantly texting her sister. Checking updates for her advocacy work. But that day, both phones were missing. So where were they? And why did that matter? Because it suggested one thing. Whoever was in that house before Maria arrived didn't want anyone calling for help. Here's where things get murky. By the time LAFD paramedics arrived at 3:36 p.m., they confirmed both victims were unresponsive, without pulse, and exhibiting early signs of rigor mortis. In simple terms, they had been dead for hours, maybe longer, which raises a massive question. If Rob and Michele died in the morning, or worse, overnight, then why was no one notified until late afternoon? Why wasn't 911 called sooner? And more importantly, where was Nick? Because according to Maria, Nick's car was parked in the driveway when she arrived. She didn't see him in the house. But that car, that red Tesla Model S, was definitely there. LAPD would later confirm that the car had been moved later that evening. But by whom? Let's break this down further. Dispatch records show LAFD treated the scene as a Code 2 unresponsive, meaning immediate but non-violent intervention. It was only after determining both individuals were deceased that the call escalated to LAPD as a Code 7 suspicious death. And that's when things spiraled. Within an hour, the entire block was shut down. Crime scene tape, forensics vans, helicopters. The media didn't get wind of it until later that night. And when they did, panic. Not just because Rob Reiner was dead, but because no one knew how. No gunshots. No visible wounds. No drugs in plain sight. It was too clean, too quiet, too clinical. And yet, somehow, it screamed murder. Here's where the timeline gets even stranger. According to traffic camera footage obtained later by investigators, Nick's car was recorded leaving the neighborhood at 8:12 a.m. that same morning. So wait, if he left that early, was he even there when they died? Possibly not. But wait, remember that scream? The one neighbors reported hearing around 2:15 a.m.? That would mean Rob and Michele were still alive well after midnight, which contradicts the coroner's estimate of time of death between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., which, in turn, overlaps with the time Nick's car was seen leaving. So which is it? Did Rob and Michele die in their sleep? Were they alive in the early morning hours? Did Nick leave before or after their deaths? Or is there a piece of this puzzle we haven't found yet? Because, and here's the twist, there was a third vehicle spotted on the street that morning. A black SUV with tinted windows. Parked across the street from the Reiners' home. No plates. It was captured on a neighbor's Ring camera. And guess what? It hasn't been identified to this day. LAPD claims they're following leads. But privately, sources say they've hit a wall. So the question remains, who was in that SUV? And did they see something? Or worse, do something? Let's go back to Maria, the housekeeper. In her formal statement, she mentioned something odd, something chilling. She said that when she walked into the house, it smelled different, like a cleaning chemical, but stronger, sharper, not something she'd ever used in their home. It was faint, fading, but there, almost like someone had wiped something down in a hurry. She didn't think much of it until she noticed the missing phones. And then, something else. The security camera system? Disabled. Offline. Every camera in the house had been disconnected from the cloud. The feed was dead. Why? Why disable the cameras? Why take the phones? Why leave the bodies so neatly posed? And then, perhaps the most overlooked clue of all. The front door was unlocked. Not forced. Not broken. Just left slightly ajar. Like someone had exited in a hurry or wanted to make it look like nothing was